In the spring of 1974, a group of farmers digging a well in Lintong County, Shaanxi Province, broke through the roof of a buried chamber. The men had been hired to dig a well to address a local water shortage. They were not archaeologists, and they had no particular reason to expect anything unusual in the soil of the orchard they were working in, even though the large earthen mound a kilometer or so to the west had been known locally for centuries as a significant place, a place associated with the tomb of a great emperor whose name was attached to the landscape the way very old names attach themselves to places, without anyone quite knowing when the naming had begun. The object that one of the men, Yang Jifa, pulled from the earth was the head of a terracotta figure. The head was human in scale and human in proportion, but it was made of fired clay, and it was not like anything the farmers had encountered in their previous digging. They had found fragments before, sherds of pottery and bits of ancient brick, the usual accumulation of things that surfaces in Chinese farmland after centuries of habitation. But this head was different. It had a face. What they had found, though they did not know this yet, was the outermost edge of the largest collection of funerary sculpture in the ancient world. The specific human drama of that first discovery, the farmers who became famous for breaking through a roof they did not know was there, is one of the more affecting opening chapters in the history of archaeological discovery. Yang Jifa, the man who pulled the first terracotta head from the earth, lived to become one of the most recognizable faces of the site, signing autographs for visitors at the museum built above the pits. His transition from peasant farmer to reluctant celebrity is itself a small human story nested inside one of the largest historical stories of the ancient world. Was the outermost edge of the largest collection of funerary sculpture in the ancient world. Beneath the fields of Lintong County, carefully positioned in 3 underground pits excavated into the yellow loess of the Wei River Valley, stood an army of more than 8,000 terracotta warriors, each one individual in its facial features, each one equipped with the weapons and the armor appropriate to its specific rank and function, each one positioned in the specific formation of a battle-ready military force. They had been standing in the dark for more than 2,000 years, waiting. The year was the 48th of the reign of the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, calculated from the beginning of his reign. It was 1974 CE. The army had been buried in approximately 210 BCE. The specific human face that Yang Jifa pulled from the earth had been down there, in the dark, for 2,184 years. The man whose burial the terracotta army was created to guard was one of the most consequential rulers in the history of the world. Yingzhang was born in 259 BCE, the son of the king of Qin, one of the 7 major states that competed for dominance during the period of Chinese history known as the Warring States period. He came to the throne of Qin at the age of 13, and over the course of the following years, combining military force, diplomatic manipulation, espionage, and the brutal willingness to do whatever was required to achieve his objectives, he systematically conquered the other 6 major states. The specific character of the man who did this, visible in the historical sources as a combination of extraordinary administrative intelligence, ruthless political will, and a specific kind of anxiety that drove both his military campaigns and his later quest for immortality, is one of the more compelling portraits of a historical ruler to have survived from the ancient world. He was not simply a conqueror. He was a builder, a standardizer, a man who believed that the disorder of competing states was a problem that required a permanent solution, and who had both the will and the capacity to impose that solution. One of the 7 major states that competed for dominance during the period of Chinese history known as the Warring States period. He came to the throne of Qin at the age of 13, and over the course of the following years, combining military force, diplomatic manipulation, espionage, and the brutal willingness to do whatever was required to achieve his objectives, he systematically conquered the other 6 major states and brought the entire territory of what is now eastern China under the control of a single ruler for the first time in history. The unification of China was completed in 221 BCE. Yingzhang was 38 years old. The specific administrative program that followed the military unification was as consequential as the unification itself. The standardization of the Chinese script across the entire empire was perhaps the single most lasting achievement of the Qin period. The specific script forms that the Qin administration imposed on the conquered territories were the foundation from which subsequent Chinese writing systems developed, and the specific principle of a unified Chinese writing system, which allows readers of different Chinese dialects to understand the same written text even when the spoken languages are mutually incomprehensible, is one of the most significant cultural achievements in the history of the Chinese civilization. Ing Zheng was 38 years old. He had been fighting for this goal, directly and through the military machine of the Qin state, for nearly 20 years. The achievement was unprecedented. No ruler before him had ever brought this vast and diverse territory under a single political authority, and the question of what to call himself was one that the new ruler took seriously enough to ask his advisors to address. The title of King, Wang, was not sufficient. There were other kings, and there had been other kings, and the new ruler of all China was not a king in the same sense. He was something that had not existed before. The title he chose, and that his advisors helped him devise, was Huangdi, Emperor. More specifically, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, because he intended his successors to be counted as the second emperor, the third emperor, and so on to the 10,000th generation. The name by which he is known in history, Qin Shi Huangdi or Qin Shi Huang, combines the dynasty name with the new imperial title, and it has attached itself to one of the most powerful and most divisive figures in the long history of Chinese civilization. The first emperor ruled his unified China for 11 years, until his death in 210 BCE during a tour of his eastern provinces. In that 11 years, he standardized the Chinese script, the weights and measures, the currency, and the axle widths of carts across the entire empire. He built a network of imperial roads. He began the construction of what would eventually become the Great Wall. He buried alive scholars who disputed his policies. He burned books that contradicted his preferred narrative of history. He unified and he destroyed in approximately equal measure, and the specific combination of these qualities has made him a figure of intense historical debate in China ever since. The landscape of the Qin tomb complex, in the Wei River valley west of the ancient city of Xi'an, is one of the most historically charged landscapes in China. The central feature of the landscape is the tomb mound of Qin Shi Huang itself, a large earthen pyramid rising approximately 76 meters above the surrounding plain. The mound has been reduced from its original height of perhaps 115 meters by 2,000 years of erosion, but it remains a substantial presence in the landscape. The specific relationship between the tomb mound and the Terracotta army pits, separated by approximately 1.5 kilometers of flat lush plain, is one that the physical experience of the site conveys more effectively than any description. Walking from the museum that now covers the pits toward the mound, or looking from the mound back toward the pits, gives a sense of the scale of the burial complex that no aerial photograph or site plan quite prepares for. The burial was not modest in any dimension. A large earthen pyramid rising approximately 76 meters above the surrounding plain. The mound has been reduced from its original height of perhaps 115 meters by 2,000 years of erosion, but it remains a substantial presence in the landscape, visible from a considerable distance and immediately recognizable as an artificial structure rather than a natural landform. The mound is now partially covered by vegetation, including fruit trees that give it the appearance, from certain angles, of a natural hill, but the specific geometry of its form speaks to its constructed character to any observer who looks carefully. The 3 pits containing the Terracotta army are located approximately 1.5 kilometers to the east of the tomb mound, and they are not in the tomb itself but in the outer precinct of the larger tomb complex. The spatial relationship between the pits and the mound reflects the specific logic of the burial. The Terracotta army was positioned to guard the approaches to the tomb from the east, the direction from which the emperor's former enemies lay, and the specific formation of the warriors, facing east in battle order, makes this directional intent explicit. The broader tomb complex, which encompasses an area of approximately 60 square kilometers, including both the inner and outer precincts of the burial, is the largest single funerary complex in the ancient world. It includes not only the 3 pits of the Terracotta army, but also a number of other underground structures that have been partially excavated, including pits containing bronze chariots and horses, pits containing terracotta acrobats and musicians, pits containing the remains of horses and the grooms who were apparently killed to accompany them, and various administrative and residential structures associated with the management of the imperial burial complex. The Wei River Valley in which the tomb complex sits was the heartland of the Qin state before the unification, and the specific choice of this location for the imperial burial reflected the first emperor's deep connection to the homeland of the dynasty that had made him. The yellow loess soil of the valley, the specific geological material of which the burial pits were constructed and which provided the raw material for the terracotta warriors themselves, is one of the characteristic features of the landscape of northwestern China, and its specific properties, its stability when dry, its susceptibility to collapse when wet, its remarkable preservation of organic materials under the right conditions, shaped both the construction of the burial and the subsequent history of its preservation. The account of the construction of the tomb, preserved in the Shiji, the records of the grand historian written by Sima Qian approximately a century after the emperor's death, is the primary literary source for the burial and is one of the more extraordinary passages in ancient historical writing. Sima Qian records that the construction of the tomb began in the year that the young prince ascended to the throne of Qin, when he was 13 years old, and continued for the remainder of his life and for some time after his death. The specific character of Sima Qian as a historical source is worth noting. He was writing approximately a century after the events he describes, drawing on earlier sources and oral traditions that are no longer directly accessible. He was also writing as an official historian of the Han dynasty, which had replaced the Qin dynasty after its rapid collapse, and the specific perspective of a Han official writing about the Qin is not a neutral one. But the physical evidence that modern investigation has produced, the mercury in the soil, the structures visible in the geophysical surveys, consistently aligns with his account in the specific ways that matter, and the scholarly consensus treats his description of the tomb as broadly reliable even where it cannot be directly verified. Of Qin, when he was 13 years old, and continued for the remainder of his life and for some time after his death. The labor force employed on the construction, according to Sima Qian, eventually reached 700,000 workers, drawn from among prisoners of war, convicted criminals, and conscript laborers from across the empire. The scale of this labor force, if the number is even approximately accurate, would make the Qin tomb among the largest single construction projects in the ancient world. The specific description of the tomb's interior that Sima Qian provides has attracted centuries of scholarly attention and considerable speculation. He describes a burial chamber in which the ceiling was decorated with representations of the heavenly bodies, with pearls used to represent the stars. He describes rivers of mercury, flowing through channels engineered to recreate the courses of the great rivers of China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze, running through the underground landscape of the tomb. He describes crossbow traps set to fire automatically if the tomb were breached. And he describes the craftsmen who built the most sensitive interior features of the tomb being sealed inside it when it was closed, to prevent them from revealing its secrets. The scientific surveys of the tomb mound that have been conducted in recent decades have produced results that are consistent with Sima Qian's account in specific and testable ways. Soil samples from the mound have shown mercury concentrations significantly above background levels, consistent with the presence of the mercury rivers that the historian described. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey methods have identified structures beneath the mound that are consistent with the presence of a large underground chamber of the kind that Sima Qian described. The historian's account was written a century after the burial, but the specific physical evidence that modern science can measure is consistent with it in the ways that matter most. Whether the full interior of the tomb, when it is eventually excavated, will match the specific details of Sima Qian's description is a question that cannot yet be answered. But the correspondence between the measurable physical evidence and the historical account has given researchers considerable confidence that the general picture Sima Qian preserves is grounded in genuine knowledge of the burial, transmitted through the century that separated the historian from the event. The terracotta warriors are the most immediate and most compelling evidence for the organizational capacity and the artistic ambition of the Qin imperial burial program. The three pits of the terracotta army are not identical in their content or their spatial organization. Pit 1, the largest, is approximately 230 meters long and 62 meters wide, and it contains the main force of the army. Infantry arranged in battle formation in the central corridor, with chariots and their teams of horses at the front, and flanking infantry units running along the sides. The specific experience of descending from the entrance of the museum building that covers Pit 1 and encountering the view of the ranked warriors from the elevated walkways above them is one that visitors consistently describe as overwhelming, even after seeing photographs and videos of the site in advance. The scale of the pit, the number of the figures, the uniformity of their eastward-facing orientation, and the individuality of their faces visible even from the distance of the walkways. These qualities together produce an effect that reproduction cannot fully convey. The sheer scale of Pit 1, which can be appreciated fully only from the elevated walkways that allow visitors to look down into the excavated portion of the pit from above, is one of the more arresting experiences in ancient site visiting anywhere in the world. Pit 2 contains a mixed force of cavalry, infantry, and chariots, organized in a formation that has been interpreted as a flanking or advance guard for the main force in Pit 1. Pit 3 is smaller and appears to represent the command structure of the army. It contains a chariot and a smaller number of figures that are interpreted as the officers and the command staff. The spatial and organizational logic of the three pits together, read as a complete military installation, represents a specific and coherent vision of a battle-ready army, and the attention to the details of military organization, rank, and function that is visible in the arrangement of the figures speaks to a burial program that was not simply producing a large quantity of figures, but was carefully recreating the specific structure of a real military force. The individual figures are between 1.7 and 2 meters tall, heavier and more massive than their height would suggest because they are solid or partially solid fired clay. Their faces are the feature that most immediately strikes visitors and most consistently returns in discussions of the figures. No two faces are identical, and the range of facial features represented, the different shapes of eyes and noses and mouths, the different styles of mustache and beard and hair arrangement, the different expressions of alertness and determination and calm, speaks to a sculptural program that was deliberately producing individual rather than generic figures. The specific technique by which the figures were produced combined mass production of standardized body parts with individual treatment of the faces and the specific details of rank and equipment. The torsos, legs, and arms of the figures were produced in standardized forms using molds and then assembled, while the heads were produced individually and the faces modeled by hand to produce the variation that distinguishes each figure from its neighbors. The figures were then painted in vivid colors, and the traces of original pigment that survive on some figures, particularly those recovered from the portions of the pits where the conditions for preservation have been most favorable, give a sense of how the army must have appeared when it was first installed. Not the gray-brown terracotta of the exposed figures in the current excavation, but a brilliantly colored force, each warrior distinguished by the specific colors of his rank and his equipment. The weapons that equipped the terracotta army were not ceremonial replicas but functional weapons of high quality, and their recovery from the pits has given researchers important information about the military technology of the Qin state. The bronze weapons found in the pits, including crossbow bolts, spearheads, halberds, and swords, were produced to the same standards as battlefield weapons and in some cases exceeded those standards in the refinement of their manufacture. the specific chromium coating found on many of the bronze weapons, which has preserved their edges in a condition of remarkable sharpness after more than 2,000 years, was initially believed to be an ancient anti-corrosion treatment of extraordinary sophistication, anticipating a metallurgical process that was not developed in the modern West until the 20th century. Subsequent analysis has qualified this interpretation, suggesting that the chromium coating may be a product of the specific chemical environment of the burial rather than a deliberate manufacturing treatment, but the preservation of the weapon edges remains remarkable regardless of its mechanism. Were produced to the same standards as battlefield weapons and in some cases exceeded those standards in the refinement of their manufacture. The bronze swords found in the pits are among the most technically accomplished bronze weapons ever recovered from an ancient Chinese context, their blades ground to a fine edge and their bronze alloy composed to a specific ratio of tin to copper that optimized the combination of hardness and flexibility. The preservation of these weapons in the relatively stable environment of the sealed pits, protected from the humidity and the biological activity of the surface environment, has allowed them to retain a degree of sharpness that is remarkable after more than 2,000 years. The crossbow trigger mechanisms found in the pits are particularly significant. The Qin state's military success was based in part on the mass deployment of the crossbow as an infantry weapon, and the trigger mechanisms that operated the Qin crossbows were precision-manufactured bronze components of considerable mechanical sophistication. The standardization of these components, documented in the specific measurements of the triggers found across the multiple pits, speaks to a manufacturing system that was producing interchangeable parts to a consistent specification, a level of industrial standardization that is not commonly associated with ancient military production. The organization of the weapons in the pits also tells a story about the Qin military system. Different categories of warriors carry different weapons appropriate to their specific role in the military formation. The archers carry crossbows and wear light armor or no armor. The heavy infantry carry spears and halberds and wear elaborate lamellar armor. The cavalry figures carry shorter weapons suitable for mounted combat, and the officers carry swords as marks of their rank. The specific correspondence between the rank and function of each figure and the weapons and armor assigned to it reflects a military organization of considerable sophistication, and the specific details of the equipment have given military historians valuable information about the organizational structure of the Qin army. The absence of wooden components, which have decayed after 2,000 years in the pits, means that the original weapons would have been more complete and more varied than the surviving evidence shows. Wooden shafts for the bronze spearheads, wooden stocks for the crossbows, and wooden elements in the chariot construction would all have been present when the pits were first sealed, and the organic decay of these components is one of the primary reasons why the pits, when the wooden ceiling structures that originally covered them decayed and collapsed, filled with the debris that preserved but also damaged the terracotta figures. The construction of the Terracotta army was one of the largest craft production enterprises in the ancient world, and the specific organization of that production is becoming increasingly visible as the archaeological research advances. The evidence from the figures themselves, including the traces of inscribed names found on the bases and the body parts of some figures, suggests that the production was organized in teams or workshops, each responsible for a specific quota of figures and each marking its products to allow quality control and accountability. The specific analysis of these inscribed names has revealed that the production workshops were organized in a hierarchical system, with different levels of supervisory responsibility encoded in the specific categories of names and titles that appear. The overall system bears a clear resemblance to the administrative organization of the Qin bureaucracy more broadly, suggesting that the same principles of hierarchical accountability that the Qin state applied to its civil administration were applied to the management of the terracotta production program as well. Found on the bases and the body parts of some figures, suggests that the production was organized in teams or workshops, each responsible for a specific quota of figures and each marking its products to allow quality control and accountability. The specific names inscribed on the figures are not the names of the warriors they represent, but the names of the craftspeople who made them or the workshops that produced them, and their systematic recovery and analysis is giving researchers a picture of the industrial organization of the production that complements the evidence from the figures themselves. The kilns in which the terracotta figures were fired have been identified at several locations in the area around the tomb complex, and the analysis of the clay from which the figures are made shows that the raw material was sourced from specific locations in the local landscape, consistent with the large-scale extraction of clay for the production program. The logistics of managing the extraction, preparation, shaping, firing, and transportation of more than 8,000 figures, each weighing several hundred kilograms, across the area of the tomb complex represents an organizational challenge of considerable scale, and the specific solutions that the Qin administration developed to manage it reflect the same capacity for large-scale administrative coordination that the Qin state demonstrated in its military campaigns and its infrastructure. Construction. The painting of the figures, which was carried out after firing with mineral pigments applied to a lacquer base coat, was another major production undertaking. The specific colors and the specific patterns used on different categories of warrior were apparently standardized according to rank and function, and the systematic application of these color schemes to more than 8,000 figures required a painting workforce of considerable size working over an extended period. The specific evidence for the original colors, preserved in the traces of pigment that survive on some figures and revealed in more detail by the analysis of recently excavated figures whose pigment has been better protected, is one of the more actively researched aspects of the current archaeological program at the site. The overall production program for the Terracotta Army, from the initial extraction of the clay to the final installation of the armed and painted figures in the completed pits, was a project of extraordinary organizational complexity that was carried out over a period of perhaps 10 to 15 years in the final decades of the first emperor's life. The specific administrative systems that managed this project, and the specific relationship between the production of the Terracotta Army and the other major construction projects of the Qin imperial program, including the tomb mound itself, the Great Wall, and the imperial road system, are questions that the scholarship is continuing to investigate. The first emperor's obsession with immortality is one of the most documented and most psychologically interesting aspects of his reign, and it shaped the scale and the character of the burial program in ways that the historical sources document in considerable detail. The quest for immortality that preoccupied the later years of the first emperor's reign was driven partly by the specific religious and cosmological beliefs of the period, and partly by the specific psychology of a man who had achieved unprecedented power and was unwilling to accept the limitation that death represented. The specific historical irony of the immortality quest is one that the sources emphasize with evident satisfaction. The man who sought immortality with such desperate intensity died at the age of 49, the same age at which his specific alchemical treatments may have accelerated the decline they were supposed to prevent. The mercury that he ingested as a component of immortality preparations, and the mercury that now lies in the rivers of his tomb, connects the first emperor's death to his burial in a specific and darkly appropriate way. Was driven partly by the specific religious and cosmological beliefs of the period, and partly by the specific psychology of a man who had achieved unprecedented power and was unwilling to accept the limitation that death represented. The Taoist and shamanic traditions of the Qin world included beliefs about the possibility of achieving physical immortality through the ingestion of specific substances, the performance of specific rituals, and the attainment of specific forms of spiritual cultivation, and the first emperor appears to have taken these beliefs seriously enough to invest significant resources in their pursuit. The historical sources record multiple expeditions sent by the emperor to search for the Islands of the Immortals, mythological places in the Eastern Sea where magical plants and elixirs of immortality were said to be found. The most famous of these expeditions was led by a man named Su Fu, who convinced the emperor that the immortality drugs he sought could be found on 3 sacred islands in the sea to the east. Su Fu departed with a fleet of ships and a company of young men and women, and he never returned. The historical sources give different accounts of his fate, some suggesting that he settled in Japan, others that he was too afraid of the emperor's displeasure at his failure to return. Whatever happened to Su Fu, His expedition was one of many such searches that consumed imperial resources without producing the immortality that the emperor sought. The mercury that Sima Qian describes as flowing through the tomb in simulated rivers may have been more than a symbolic representation of the Chinese landscape. Mercury was associated in the alchemical traditions of the period with longevity and with the preservation of the body after death, and the specific association of mercury with the pursuit of immortality gives the mercury rivers of the tomb a cosmological significance that goes beyond their function as a representation of the empire's geography. The first emperor may not have found the immortality he sought in life, but the tomb he built for himself was designed to sustain him in death in a way that reflected his understanding of what death required and what lay beyond it. The specific irony that the emperor's quest for immortality may have contributed to his death is documented in the historical sources. The alchemical preparations of mercury and other substances that were administered to the emperor as immortality treatments in his final years may themselves have caused or accelerated the decline that led to his death. The specific medical effects of chronic mercury exposure are consistent with the symptoms described in the historical accounts of the emperor's final illness, and the possibility that the pursuit of immortality was itself lethal is one of the darker details in the story of the first emperor's life. The political and administrative achievements of the Qin state under the first emperor were as remarkable as the burial program, and understanding the burial requires understanding the specific historical moment that produced it. The unification of China in 221 BCE was not simply a military achievement. It was the culmination of a specific political and administrative program that the Qin state had been developing and refining for more than a century before the unification, and the specific institutional innovations of the Qin reformers, particularly the legalist philosopher and statesman Xiangyang, were as important to the outcome as the military prowess of the Qin army. Xiangyang's reforms, implemented in the middle of the 4th century BCE, had transformed the Qin state from a conventional feudal polity into a highly centralized administrative state in which authority was concentrated in the hands of the ruler and exercised through a bureaucracy of appointed officials rather than through a hereditary aristocracy. The specific administrative instruments of the Qin state, including the standardized legal code, the census and registration system that tracked the population for taxation and military conscription, and the merit-based system of bureaucratic appointment and promotion, were the institutional foundation on which the first emperor's empire was built. When the unification was complete, these Qin institutions were extended across the entire conquered territory, and the standardization of script, weights, measures, and currency that followed was both a practical administrative measure and a symbolic assertion of the unity of the new empire. The construction of the Great Wall, which was carried out in the early years of the unified empire by connecting and extending the existing frontier walls of the northern states, was one of the largest infrastructure projects in the ancient world, requiring the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers across several years. The specific military logic of the wall, which was intended to control the movement of the nomadic pastoralist peoples of the northern steppe rather than to create an impassable barrier, reflected the first emperor's recognition that the primary security threat to the unified empire came from the north, from the confederacy of nomadic peoples known as the Xiongnu. The imperial road system, which connected the capital at Xianying to the distant provinces of the empire through a network of standardized roads maintained by the state, was another major infrastructure investment that served both military and administrative functions. The specific width of the roads and the specific spacing of the postal stations along them were standardized by imperial decree, and the road network allowed the rapid movement of both troops and administrative communications across an empire that stretched from the northern frontier to the southern coast. The legacy of the first emperor in Chinese history is one of the more contested questions in the long tradition of Chinese historical and political thought, and the debate about his significance has not been resolved in more than 2,000 years of reflection. The traditional Confucian critique of the first emperor, which was already being formulated by scholars in the generation after his death, focused on the specific violations of Confucian political morality that his reign represented. The burning of books, the burial of scholars, the imposition of a harsh legalist legal code. These were acts that the Confucian tradition characterized as the expressions of a tyrannical ruler. The specific complexity of the historical judgment is reflected in the fact that both the harshest critics and the most enthusiastic admirers of the first emperor have found ample evidence for their positions in the same historical record. The burning of books and the burial of scholars are real. The unification of China, the standardization of the script, and the creation of the institutional framework for the subsequent 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history are also real. The specific moral and historical balance between these categories of achievement and failure is one that Chinese historians have been debating ever since, without reaching a consensus that has satisfied everyone, which was already being formulated by scholars in the generation after his death, focused on the specific violations of Confucian political morality that his reign represented. The burning of books, the burial of scholars, the imposition of a harsh legalist legal code that punished minor infractions with severe physical penalties, the conscription of hundreds of thousands of workers for construction projects that killed many of them. These were acts that the Confucian tradition characterized as the expressions of a tyrannical ruler who had violated the fundamental obligations of the ruler to his people. The rapid collapse of the Qin dynasty after the emperor's death, in a rebellion that began within months of his death and that destroyed the dynasty within 3 years, was interpreted by Confucian historians as the natural consequence of tyrannical misrule. The counter-tradition, which emphasized the first emperor's positive achievements, acknowledged that the unification of China was an event of enormous historical significance and that the specific institutional innovations of the Qin state had created the framework within which the subsequent Chinese imperial tradition operated for more than 2,000 years. The Han dynasty that replaced the Qin after the rebellion adopted and continued most of the Qin administrative institutions, including the centralized bureaucratic state, the standardized script and measures, and the imperial road system, even as it rejected the more extreme features of the Qin legal code and the specific ideological framework of legalism. The lasting influence of the Qin institutional legacy on the subsequent Chinese imperial tradition is evidence that the first emperor's achievements were genuinely significant rather than simply the temporary imposition of a powerful will. The specific reception of the first emperor in 20th and 21st century China has added a further layer of complexity to the historical debate. Mao Zedong famously compared himself favorably to the first emperor, embracing the tradition of ruthless unification as a model for his own project of national consolidation. The contemporary Chinese government's management of the Terracotta army site, and the specific way in which the first emperor is presented to the millions of visitors who come to see the warriors each year, reflects a specific political judgment about the significance of the unification and about the relationship between the ancient imperial tradition and the contemporary Chinese national identity that is itself part of the ongoing historical debate. The excavation of the Terracotta army pits is one of the largest and most complex archaeological projects in the world, and the specific challenges it presents have shaped the pace and the methodology of the research over the past 5 decades. The sheer scale of the excavation is the primary challenge. Pit 1 alone contains an estimated 6,000 figures, and the process of excavating, documenting, and conserving each figure, along with the weapons, armor, and other objects associated with it, requires years of careful work for each section of the pit. The specific rate of excavation at the site has been deliberately slowed in recent decades as the conservation challenges have become better understood. The decision to prioritize the quality of the conservation over the pace of the excavation reflects a mature approach to the management of an irreplaceable archaeological resource, and it is one that the international archaeological community has strongly endorsed even when it has meant that specific portions of the pits have remained unexcavated for decades while the conservation technology necessary to excavate them responsibly has been developed. Pit 1 alone contains an estimated 6,000 figures, and the process of excavating, documenting, and conserving each figure, along with the weapons, armor, and other objects associated with it, and the structural features of the pit itself, requires years of careful work for each section of the pit. The total number of figures across the 3 pits, estimated at more than 8,000, means that the full excavation of the site will take decades more even at the current pace of work. The fragility of the painted decoration on the newly excavated figures is one of the most serious technical challenges. The lacquer base coat on which the mineral pigments were applied is stable when it is sealed within the soil environment of the pit, but when the figures are exposed to air and light during excavation, the lacquer can dry and contract rapidly, causing the pigment to flake off within hours or days of exposure. The development of conservation techniques to stabilize the painted surface before and during excavation has been one of the major research priorities of the Terracotta Army Archaeological Program, and the collaboration between Chinese and international conservation scientists on this specific problem has produced methods that are now being applied to newly excavated figures. The deliberate decision to leave significant portions of the pits unexcavated, pending the development of better conservation techniques, reflects a policy of responsible management of irreplaceable archaeological resources that has been widely praised by the international archaeological community. The portions of the pits that were excavated in the 1970s and 1980s, before the specific conservation challenges were fully understood, suffered significant pigment loss, and the surviving traces of original color on those early figures are much sparser than on the more recently excavated ones. The decision to wait until the conservation technology is adequate to preserve what is found before excavating further is an acknowledgement that the archaeological resource is not renewable and that the opportunity to recover it properly, once lost, cannot be recovered. The ongoing research at the site also includes the systematic survey of the broader tomb complex using non-invasive methods, including ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and soil gas analysis. These methods have identified multiple underground structures beyond the 3 pits that have been excavated, and each new discovery expands the picture of the burial program and raises new questions about the specific intentions behind the various components of the complex. The tomb mound of Qin Shi Huang, which has never been excavated, is one of the great unresolved questions in the archaeology of the ancient world. The specific decision not to excavate the tomb has been justified on several grounds. The mercury content of the soil around the mound, which the geochemical surveys have confirmed is significantly elevated above background levels, represents a genuine health and safety challenge for any excavation. The specific question of when the tomb will be excavated is one that generates regular public discussion in China and internationally, and the Chinese government has been consistent in its position that the tomb will not be opened until the conservation technology is adequate to preserve what is found. The specific conservation challenges presented by the tomb, which may contain organic materials, pigments, and other sensitive objects that would be damaged by exposure to air, are ones that the existing technology has not yet fully resolved, and the responsible management of the resource requires waiting until it has. The mercury content of the soil around the mound, which the geochemical surveys have confirmed is significantly elevated above background levels in patterns consistent with Sima Qian's description of mercury rivers inside the burial chamber, represents a genuine health and safety challenge for any excavation. The preservation challenges posed by the painted and decorated objects that may be present inside the chamber, including the specific problem of maintaining the condition of organic materials, pigments, and other sensitive materials under the conditions of a Chinese excavation, are ones that the existing conservation technology may not be adequate to address. The specific legal and ethical dimensions of opening the tomb are also significant. The tomb is not simply an archaeological site in the conventional sense. It is the burial place of a specific historical individual, and the specific norms surrounding the excavation of human burials have evolved significantly since the Terracotta Army was first excavated in the 1970s. The descendants of Qin Shi Huang, who would have a cultural claim to the burial under any framework that took seriously the rights of descendants to the remains of their ancestors, are not easily identifiable after more than 2,000 years. But the principle that the decision to open a burial of this significance is not purely a scientific one has been acknowledged in the public discussion of the question. The specific excitement that surrounds the eventual opening of the tomb is not merely the excitement of archaeological discovery. It is the excitement of a specific narrative payoff. the confirmation or the refutation of Sima Qian's description of the interior, the revelation of what a unified China's first emperor considered appropriate provision for his afterlife, the encounter with whatever has been preserved in the mercury-laden darkness of the burial chamber for more than 2,000 years. Whether the interior will match the historical description, whether it will contain objects that transform the understanding of the Qin period, and whether the conservation technology available at the time of eventual excavation will be adequate to preserve what is found. These are questions that the current generation of researchers cannot answer, and that may be answered only by a future generation whose tools and techniques we cannot yet predict. The specific context of the Terracotta Army within the broader tradition of Chinese funerary art and practice illuminates both its continuities with earlier Chinese burial traditions and its radical departures from them. The tradition of burying objects and sometimes people with the dead was deeply rooted in Chinese culture well before the Qin period. The Shang dynasty tombs of the 2nd millennium BCE contained not only elaborate bronze vessels and jade objects but the bodies of sacrificed humans and animals, killed to accompany the dead ruler into the afterlife. The specific trajectory from actual sacrifice to terracotta substitution that is visible in the Chinese funerary tradition across the centuries before the Qin period is one of the more interesting examples of the gradual humanization of funerary practice in any ancient culture. The substitution principle, which allows the desired provision for the dead to be represented by a symbolic analog rather than by the actual sacrificed person or animal, was not unique to China, but the specific scale and the specific realism of the Qin application of the principle has no parallel in the broader ancient world. Well before the Qin period, the Zhou dynasty tombs that followed continued the tradition of elaborate burial provision, though the practice of human sacrifice in burials was gradually replaced by the substitution of clay figurines, wooden figures, and other representations of the living things that had previously been killed for the burial. The Terracotta Army stands in a specific relationship to this earlier tradition of substitution. The use of clay figures rather than living soldiers to guard the emperor's tomb follows the logic of substitution that had developed in Chinese funerary practice over the preceding centuries. But the scale and the specificity of the Qin substitution, the deliberate production of more than 8,000 individual figures each equipped with functional weapons and positioned in the formations of a real army, represents a transformation of the substitution tradition that goes so far beyond its precedents as to constitute something essentially new. The specific question of why the first emperor chose to guard his burial with a terracotta army rather than with a real one, or with a smaller and less elaborate collection of funerary objects, is one that the historical sources address only indirectly. The most plausible explanation connects the specific character of the burial to the specific character of the man. A ruler who had spent his entire adult life creating and commanding the most formidable military force in the ancient Chinese world, and who was unwilling to face whatever lay beyond death without the protection of that force. The army that had conquered 6 states and unified China would guard the tomb for eternity, as it had guarded the emperor in life. The specific human dimension of the terracotta figures, their individual faces and their individual identities as warriors of specific rank and function, also speaks to a burial conception that was less interested in symbolic substitution than in actual recreation. The first emperor was not simply providing symbolic military protection. He was creating an underground world that was meant to function as a real world, and the functional weapons and the individual faces and the specific military formations were the specific details of that world's reality. The comparison between the Qin burial complex and other major royal burials of the ancient world illuminates the specific character of the Chinese imperial funerary tradition and the specific ambitions that the first emperor brought to it. The most direct comparison in terms of scale and organizational ambition is with the Egyptian pyramid complex, and the comparison is instructive at multiple levels. Both the pyramid complex of Giza and the Qin tomb complex are the burial places of rulers who understood themselves as divine or semi-divine beings, whose tombs were constructed as microcosms of a specific cosmological vision of the world. The specific difference in the intended visibility of the two burial traditions is striking. The Egyptian pyramid was designed to be as visible as possible, a mountain of stone rising above the desert that would be unmistakable from a great distance and that would endure as a marker of royal achievement forever. The Qin tomb was designed to be hidden, an underground world accessible only to the emperor in death, its terracotta army sealed in its pits in the dark, the tomb mound above it eroding gradually toward the appearance of a natural hill. The two traditions represent opposite conceptions of what a royal burial should do, and both have proven more durable than most of the civilizations that have existed in between. And the comparison is instructive at multiple levels. Both the pyramid complex of Giza and the Qin tomb complex are the burial places of rulers who understood themselves as divine or semi-divine beings, whose tombs were constructed as microcosms of a specific cosmological vision of the world, and whose construction required the mobilization of enormous labor forces over extended periods. The specific differences between the two traditions, the above-ground monumentality of the Egyptian pyramids versus the underground concealment of the Qin burial, reflect different conceptions of what a royal tomb should do and what it should express. The shaft graves of Mycenae, which contain the richest concentration of metalwork from the ancient Greek world, and the royal tombs of Ur in Mesopotamia, which included the mass sacrifice of court attendants to accompany the dead ruler, are other relevant comparisons. The Qin burial shares with the Ur royal tombs the practice of accompanying the dead ruler with a retinue, though the Qin solution of terracotta substitutes rather than real sacrificial victims represents a more humane development of the same basic concept. The bronze horses and chariots found in the Qin outer precinct pits, and the apparent killing of actual horses and their grooms in other pits, show the burial program operating simultaneously at both levels, with some categories of accompanying objects represented in terracotta and others represented by actual sacrificed animals and humans. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, provides an interesting comparison for thinking about what the unopened tomb of Qin Shi Huang might contain. Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh who died young and whose burial was relatively modest by Egyptian royal standards, and yet the contents of his tomb, including the gold coffin and the elaborate funerary furniture, were sufficient to transform the understanding of Egyptian royal material culture and to generate global public fascination that has lasted a century. The tomb of the man who unified China, filled with the equivalent provision for a ruler whose ambitions were rather larger than those of Tutankhamun, is a prospect that the imagination finds it difficult to encompass. What makes the terracotta army different from other ancient funerary art is the specific combination of scale, individual characterization, and functional realism that gives it a character unlike any other archaeological discovery. The individual faces of the warriors are the feature that most consistently impresses visitors and researchers, and the specific character of that individuality is worth examining carefully. The faces are not portraits in the modern sense of being likenesses of specific real individuals. The specific effect of encountering the individual faces of the warriors, the sense of being in the presence of specific people rather than generic figures, is one that the scale of the production program makes philosophically interesting. Each face is individual, but none is a portrait. Each warrior is a person, in some sense, but no specific person. The 8,000 faces are 8,000 variations on the theme of a Qin soldier, produced by craftspeople who were generating individual difference from a finite vocabulary of standard elements, and the result is an army that is simultaneously uniform and individual in a way that mirrors the Qin administrative system's combination of standardized procedure and individual execution. And researchers, and the specific character of that individuality is worth examining carefully. The facial features are constructed from a limited range of standard elements: eyes, nose, mouth, jaw, ear shapes, each available in a specific range of variants, combined in specific ways to produce the variation that gives each figure a distinct appearance. The specific technique is closer to the police composite drawing technique than to portraiture. It produces faces that are individual in appearance without being portraits of specific people. The scale of the army, however, is the feature that most fundamentally distinguishes it from any other ancient funerary assemblage. 8,000 individual figures, each one more than 1.5 meters tall, each one equipped with functional weapons, each one positioned in the specific formation of a battle-ready military force. This is not simply a large collection of funerary objects. It is a specific kind of ambition given material form, the ambition of a man who had conquered the known world and was not willing to face the unknown world of death without the specific protection that had served him in life. The combination of mass production and individual characterization that the Terracotta production program achieved is itself a remarkable organizational accomplishment. The ability to produce more than 8,000 figures that are individually differentiated in face and expression while maintaining the standardized forms, proportions, and equipment that give the army its visual coherence required the development of a production system of considerable sophistication. And the specific methods that the Qin workshops used to achieve this combination have been studied in detail by researchers who have analyzed the clay composition, the mold forms, and the assembly techniques visible in the figures. The terracotta army is therefore simultaneously a funerary object and a military object, a work of art and a work of engineering, a symbol of imperial power and a reflection of specific organizational capacity. The specific combination of these qualities gives it a complexity that resists simple characterization, and the ongoing research at the site continues to reveal new dimensions of both the burial program and the civilization that produced it. The specific social and human dimensions of the terracotta army production, including the lives of the workers who made the figures and the officials who managed the project, are preserved in fragmentary but genuine form in the archaeological and historical evidence. The inscribed names on the bases and body parts of some figures, which are now understood to refer to the workshops or the supervisors responsible for specific portions of the production, represent one of the more direct windows into the organization of the labor force that produced the army. The human cost of the production program, which is only indirectly visible in the archaeological record, was the cost of the Qin state's labor system more broadly. The conscripted workers who had no choice but to participate in the construction of the emperor's burial at whatever personal cost the work demanded, and the conditions under which many of them lived and died. The evidence from the workers' burials near the tomb complex speaks of a labor force that was treated as a resource to be consumed rather than as a community to be sustained, which are now understood to refer to the workshops or the supervisors responsible for specific portions of the production, represent one of the more direct windows into the organization of the labor force that produced the army. The specific names that have been recovered include both official titles and personal names, and the systematic analysis of their distribution across the figures is giving researchers a picture of how the production was organized and managed that complements the evidence from the physical character of the figures themselves. The laborers who carried out the clay extraction, the shaping, the firing, and the transportation of the figures were predominantly conscript workers and prisoners, the same categories of labor that were deployed on the construction of the tomb mound and the Great Wall. The specific conditions in which these workers lived and labored are documented in the legal texts recovered from other Qin administrative sites, which give a detailed picture of the Qin state's management of its labor force. The specific rations provided to workers of different categories, the specific punishments for failure to meet production quotas, and the specific administrative procedures for recording the work done by each unit of workers. The artisans who shaped the individual faces of the warriors and who applied the painted decoration were workers of a different category from the bulk laborers who prepared the clay and assembled the standardized body parts. The skill required to model individually differentiated faces at the rate that the production program demanded required craft expertise that took years to develop, and the specific individuals who possessed this skill would have been valuable resources whose employment and management required specific attention. The specific identity of any individual sculptor who worked on the terracotta army is not recoverable from the surviving evidence, but the general picture of a specialized craft workforce embedded within a much larger general labor force is consistent with the organizational model that the Qin state applied to its other major construction projects. The death of many workers during the construction of the tomb complex is documented in the historical sources, and the specific burial sites of workers who died during the construction have been identified in the vicinity of the tomb complex. The evidence of these burials, some of them showing signs of the specific physical conditions associated with heavy labor and inadequate nutrition, speaks of the human cost of the construction program in a way that the magnificent finished product tends to obscure. The discovery of the Terracotta Army in 1974 transformed not only the understanding of the Qin period in Chinese history, but also the broader global understanding of ancient Chinese civilization. Before the discovery, the material evidence for the specific character of the Qin imperial court, and for the organizational and artistic achievements of the brief Qin dynasty, was relatively sparse. The Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years, too short a period to produce the accumulated material record that longer dynasties leave behind, and the deliberate destruction of Qin administrative records by the Han rebels who overthrew the dynasty meant that the documentary evidence for the Qin period was also limited. The Terracotta Army, produced by the Qin state at the height of its organizational capacity, gave researchers a window into the material culture of the period of a specificity and a richness that no other surviving source could provide. The specific evidence that the Terracotta Army provides for the organizational capacity of the Qin state was one of its more significant scholarly contributions. The ability to produce more than 8,000 individually characterized figures, each equipped with functional weapons and positioned in the formations of a battle-ready army, demonstrated a level of industrial organization and administrative coordination that the traditional scholarly picture of the Qin state had not fully captured. The specific production system that the analysis of the figures has revealed, with its combination of standardized mass production and individual craft finishing, is itself a reflection of the broader Qin administrative system, with its combination of standardized bureaucratic procedures and the exercise of individual judgment within those procedures. The global public fascination generated by the discovery, which has made the Terracotta Army one of the most recognized archaeological sites in the world and one of the most visited in China, has also had significant implications for the practice of Chinese archaeology more broadly. The international attention focused on the site has brought international resources and international expertise to its investigation, and the collaborative research programs that have developed around the site have been models for the broader development of international collaboration in Chinese archaeology. The specific contribution of the discovery to Chinese national identity and to the Chinese understanding of the country's deep history is another dimension of its significance that deserves acknowledgement. The first emperor remains a deeply ambiguous figure in the Chinese historical tradition, but the sheer scale and the specific character of the burial he left behind have made him a point of national pride as well as a subject of moral debate, and the Terracotta Army has become one of the most powerful symbols of the antiquity and the achievement of Chinese civilization in the global imagination. The specific contribution of the Terracotta Army to the development of Chinese archaeology as a professional discipline is also significant. The scale and the complexity of the site required the development of new methods, new conservation techniques, and new organizational frameworks for managing large-scale archaeological projects that have influenced the practice of Chinese archaeology more broadly. The site has been a training ground for Chinese archaeologists and conservators for 50 years, and the expertise developed at Lintong has been applied to archaeological challenges across China. The ongoing research at the Terracotta Army site and the broader Qin tomb complex is producing new discoveries at a steady pace and is likely to continue doing so for generations. The excavation of the eastern end of Pit 1, which was not systematically excavated in the initial work of the 1970s and 1980s, has been one of the major research programs of recent years. The figures recovered from this section of the pit include some of the best preserved examples of original pigmentation ever found at the site, and the conservation technology developed for their excavation has set new standards for the preservation of painted archaeological materials in Chinese conditions. The specific discoveries from this excavation, including figures in poses and with attributes not previously seen in the already excavated portions of the pit, are expanding the picture of the Army's composition and its specific military organization. The excavation of Pit 3, the command pit, was largely completed in the early excavations of the 1980s, but the ongoing study of the objects recovered from it, including the specific weapons and the organizational details of the chariot and its attendant figures, continues to produce new understanding of the command structure of the Terracotta Army and of its relationship to the actual command structure of the Qin military. The survey of the broader tomb complex using non-invasive methods has been particularly productive in recent years, identifying new underground structures at multiple locations within the outer precinct of the burial complex. Some of these structures have been tentatively identified based on the character of the geophysical anomalies they produce, while others remain entirely enigmatic. The systematic investigation of these features, using a combination of non-invasive survey and targeted small-scale excavation where the evidence justifies it, will expand the picture of the burial program significantly as the research progresses. The planned future excavation of the tomb mound itself remains the most anticipated development in the field. The specific timeline for any such excavation is not established, and the decision to proceed will depend on the development of conservation technology adequate to preserve what is found and on the resolution of the legal and ethical questions that surround the opening of the burial. But the combination of the mercury evidence, the historical account of Sima Qian, and the results of the non-invasive surveys all point to the presence of a burial chamber of extraordinary richness beneath the mound, and the eventual investigation of that chamber is one of the most anticipated events in the history of world archaeology. The specific character of the anticipation surrounding the eventual excavation of the tomb is one that combines scientific curiosity with a more personal kind of fascination. The first emperor of China is a figure of enormous historical significance, and the thought of encountering the specific provision he made for his own eternity, the objects he chose, the arrangements he commissioned, the specific form his understanding of death took in material terms, is compelling in a way that goes beyond the usual excitement of archaeological discovery. What modern archaeology has established about the Qin period through the investigation of the Terracotta Army and the broader tomb complex has fundamentally changed the understanding of one of the most pivotal moments in Chinese history. The specific evidence for the organizational capacity of the Qin state, visible in the production system that made the Terracotta Army, has given researchers a material basis for assessing the historical claims about the scale and the efficiency of the Qin administrative system that previously rested primarily on literary sources. The specific details of the standardization visible in the weapons, the measurements of the components, and the consistency of the production quality across the more than 8,000 figures of the army are all consistent with the picture of a highly centralized and administratively efficient state that the historical sources describe, and in some respects they go beyond what the historical sources had suggested. The paleogenetic and isotopic analysis of the human remains found in the vicinity of the tomb complex, including the workers' burials and the remains of individuals apparently interred with the burial in the inner precinct, has begun to provide information about the geographic origins and the dietary histories of the people associated with the construction and the maintenance of the burial. The evidence for individuals from distant parts of the empire in the worker population is consistent with the historical accounts of the forced labor program, and the specific isotopic signatures of different individuals give a picture of a labor force drawn from diverse geographic origins across the unified empire. The study of the Qin legal and administrative texts recovered from archaeological sites elsewhere in China, including the remarkable collections of bamboo and wooden slips found at sites in Hubei and other provinces, has expanded the documentary basis for understanding the Qin administrative system and has given researchers new tools for interpreting the specific organizational evidence visible in the Terracotta production program. The integration of the archaeological evidence from the tomb complex with the documentary evidence from the administrative texts is producing an increasingly complete picture of the Qin state at the height of its power. The specific contribution of the Terracotta Army discovery to the global public understanding of ancient Chinese civilization and to the development of cultural diplomacy between China and the rest of the world in the decades since the discovery is a dimension of its significance that extends beyond the specifically archaeological. The traveling exhibitions of terracotta warrior replicas and original pieces that have toured museums worldwide since the 1980s have introduced millions of people outside China to one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and the global recognition of the site is itself part of the continuing story of the Terracotta Army's place in the world. The specific impact of the discovery on Chinese national consciousness has been profound and lasting. The Terracotta Army has become one of the most powerful symbols of the antiquity and the achievement of Chinese civilization, and its presence in the global imagination, achieved through the traveling exhibitions and the media coverage of the past 50 years, has given China a cultural landmark comparable in global recognition to the pyramids of Egypt or the Parthenon of Athens. What remains uncertain about the Terracotta Army and the tomb of Qin Shi Huang encompasses some of the most fundamental and most exciting questions in the archaeology of the ancient world. The contents of the tomb mound are the central unknown. The specific treasures, objects, and structures that Sima Qian's account describes have not been confirmed by direct investigation, and while the mercury evidence and the geophysical surveys are consistent with his account in important ways, the specific character of the interior of the burial chamber is not known. Whether the painted ceiling with its stellar geography survives, whether the mercury rivers are intact, whether the specific objects that the historical sources associate with the burial are present and in what condition. These are questions that only direct investigation can answer, and that investigation has not yet occurred. The specific identity of the individuals whose remains have been found within the inner precinct of the burial complex is another area of genuine uncertainty. Some of these individuals may be members of the imperial family who died before or after the emperor and were buried in the complex, and others may be members of the court or the palace staff who were killed to accompany the emperor in death. The specific status and identity of these individuals, and the specific circumstances of their death, are questions that the evidence addresses only partially. The complete extent of the buried structures within the 60 square kilometer area of the tomb complex is not yet known. The non-invasive surveys have identified multiple anomalies that have not been investigated, and the possibility that the outer precinct contains significant structures that have not yet been discovered is real. The specific character of these unidentified structures and their relationship to the overall plan of the burial complex are questions that will be addressed only as the survey program continues and as targeted excavations are carried out. The specific mechanisms by which the terracotta figures were made and the specific organization of the production workforce are areas where the research is still actively developing. The analysis of the clay composition, the assembly techniques, and the inscribed names on the figures is giving an increasingly detailed picture of the production system, but many specific questions about the workflow, the quality control systems, and the organizational hierarchy of the production remain incompletely answered. The question of what specific objects, structures, and decorative programs are present within the sealed tomb mound is one that will only be resolved by direct investigation. The combination of the historical account and the geophysical evidence gives a picture of extraordinary richness, but the specific detail of what is actually there, in the condition that 2,000 years of sealed underground existence has left it, is unknown. The tomb is one of the very few places in the ancient world where a genuinely transformative archaeological discovery is not only possible but seems likely. The Terracotta Army changes how we think about the ancient world and about the range of ambitions that ancient rulers brought to the provision for their own deaths. The most immediate implication is about the specific character of ancient Chinese civilization at the moment of its first unification. The organization required to produce the Terracotta Army, the administrative infrastructure that managed the labor force, the production system that combined mass manufacturing with individual craft finishing, and the logistical systems that transported and installed the completed figures in the burial pits. All of these speak to a civilization of extraordinary organizational sophistication operating at the moment that it achieved political unification for the first time. The broader implication is about the relationship between political power and funerary ambition. The Terracotta Army is, among other things, a statement about the specific understanding that the first emperor had of what death required and what lay beyond it, and the specific scale and character of that statement is directly connected to the specific scale and character of the political achievement that preceded it. A man who had conquered the known world was not going to face the unknown world with a modest burial provision, and the specific form that his immodesty took, the recreation of the army that had won China for him, is a specific kind of poetry in clay and bronze. The question of what the Terracotta army means, and what it tells us about the civilization that produced it, is one that cannot be answered simply by describing the figures or counting their weapons. It requires engaging with the specific human reality behind the production. The workers who shaped the clay, the officials who managed the project, the emperor whose obsession with death and immortality drove the whole enterprise, and the specific historical moment of the unification of China that gave the burial its particular weight and its particular character. The warriors are still standing in their formations. The tomb mound is still sealed, 2 kilometers away across the lush plain of the Wei River Valley. The mercury is still there, in concentrations that the geochemical surveys can measure but the open air cannot yet safely encounter. And the first emperor of China is still waiting, in the specific darkness of the burial chamber that his craftsmen built for him more than 2,000 years ago, for whatever comes next. The specific ambition of the Terracotta army, and of the entire burial program, is the ambition of a man who had achieved something that no one before him had achieved, and who was not prepared to accept that the world he had created would outlast him without his continued presence in it. The specific form that this ambition took, the recreation of the army that had won him the world, is a kind of poetry in clay and bronze, and the warriors standing in their formations in the underground dark are still carrying that ambition with them, patient and unchanged, after more than 2,000 years. The people of the Qin world were fully human in every sense, and the evidence they left behind gives a genuine window into the specific character of a civilization at the most consequential moment in its history. The farmer Yang Jifa, whose well digging in 1974 broke through the roof of the burial pit and began the process of recovery that has transformed the understanding of ancient Chinese history, was doing what farmers in Lintong County had been doing for centuries. Working the lush soil of the Wei River Valley in an effort to extract a living from one of the most densely farmed landscapes in the world. The specific human accident of that encounter, the wrong place to dig a well, the buried chamber where the farmer expected only more soil, is one of the more affecting moments in the history of archaeological discovery. Yang Jifa lived to see his chance discovery become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, and his story, from peasant farmer to reluctant celebrity, is itself a small human thread in the enormous historical tapestry of the Terracotta army. The craftspeople who modeled the individual faces of the warriors were making specific decisions about specific faces, choosing from the available range of eye shapes and nose forms and mouth positions to produce a face that was distinct from the ones they had already made. The specific mental act of looking at a face already made and deciding what this next one should be different in, repeated thousands of times across the years of the production program, is a recognizably human creative act, even if it was carried out under conditions of political compulsion rather than artistic freedom. The first emperor himself, for all the enormous distance between him and any ordinary human experience, left evidence of a specific human psychology in the historical sources. A man who was afraid of death, who sent expeditions to the end of the world in search of immortality, who surrounded himself with an underground army of clay soldiers because the real army was not available to guard him in death. This is a portrait of a specific kind of fear, the fear of a man who had achieved everything and was therefore unwilling to lose anything, including the life that his achievements had made so extraordinary. The warriors that his craftspeople made are still carrying his fear with them, 2,000 years later, standing in their formations in the dark beneath the fields of Shaanxi. They will still be there when the decision is finally made to open the tomb and to see what the most powerful man in the ancient Chinese world considered appropriate provision for eternity. The specific connection between Yang Jifa's discovery of the first terracotta head in 1974 and the global recognition that the site has achieved in the 50 years since is one of the more improbable stories in the history of cultural heritage. A farmer digging a well broke through the roof of a chamber that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years, and the civilization that built the chamber was unknown to the vast majority of the world's population until that moment. The recovery of the Terracotta Army, and through it of the specific character of the Qin imperial achievement, has been one of the more significant acts of historical retrieval in the modern era. The central image of the Terracotta Army is the view from the elevated walkways of Pit 1, looking down into the excavated sections of the burial pit at the formations of warriors standing in their corridors of packed earth. The scale of what is visible from the walkways is larger than any photograph prepares the visitor for. The warriors stand in ranked files, each file separated from the next by the earthen partition walls of the pit's internal structure, their faces looking forward toward the east, their bodies in the specific posture of a soldier at attention, waiting. The variation of the individual faces, visible even from the walkways above the pit floor, gives the mass formation a quality of individual presence that larger and more uniform assemblages do not have. Each figure is a person, in some specific sense, even after 2,000 years of burial and more than 50 years of excavation and display. The colors that survive on some of the figures, traces of the vivid pigmentation that once covered the entire army, are easier to see in the museum cases where recently excavated pieces are displayed than in the pit itself. The specific blues and greens and reds that the Qin painters applied to the warriors' costumes and equipment are preserved in small areas of surviving pigment that give a sense of what the army must have looked like when it was first sealed in its pits in 210 BCE. Not the gray-brown landscape of fired clay that the visitor sees today, but a brilliantly colored force, each warrior an individual, each unit distinguished by the specific colors of its rank. The specific quality of silence in the pit, the absence of the sound of human activity in the underground space where the warriors have been waiting for more than 2,000 years, is something that the photographs and the films and the guided tours only approximate. The warriors have been standing in this silence for longer than the entire history of European civilization, and the specific weight of that duration is something that the material presence of the figures, their scale and their individual faces and their functional weapons, makes available to the imagination in a way that no other archaeological site quite matches. The tomb mound is visible from the site on clear days, a green hill in the distance to the west, its specific geometry revealing its constructed character to anyone who looks carefully at the shape of the horizon. The emperor is still there, 2 kilometers away, in the darkness that his craftspeople prepared for him. The warriors are still here, in the pit that was designed to guard his approach to the afterlife. The distance between them is 2 kilometers and more than 2,000 years, and the work of closing that distance is still underway. The specific quality of the terracotta faces, their combination of standard elements and individual variation, their suggestion of specific people without being portraits of anyone in particular, is something that the photographs and the descriptions approach but do not fully capture. The experience of standing at the edge of Pit 1 and looking down at the ranked warriors, their individual faces visible even from the elevated walkways above them, is one that visitors consistently describe as more affecting than they had anticipated, as though the specifically human character of the faces creates a connection across the 2,000-year gap that the abstract scale of the numbers does not. The ongoing management of the Terracotta Army site as one of the world's most visited archaeological attractions presents a specific set of challenges that the responsible care of the archaeological resource requires addressing. The number of visitors to the site, which exceeds 2 million per year in normal years and has at times approached 4 million, creates physical pressures on the buried archaeological resource and on the conservation environment of the open pits that require continuous monitoring and management. The humidity generated by large numbers of people in the enclosed space of the pit shelters, and the physical wear on the pathways and the viewing structures, are among the specific challenges that the site management team must address as part of the ongoing conservation of the resource. The balance between the presentation of the site to visitors and the protection of the archaeological resource is one of the central challenges of the management of any major open excavation, and the specific conditions of the Terracotta Army site, with its combination of ongoing active excavation in some sections and long-term stable display in others, make the management particularly complex. The development of visitor management systems that can distribute the large numbers of visitors across the site in ways that minimize pressure on the most sensitive areas while still providing the access that makes the site meaningful is an ongoing concern. The conservation research program at the site, which addresses both the long-term stability of the excavated figures and the development of new methods for the conservation of future excavations, is one of the more productive areas of current work. The collaboration between the research teams at the site and conservation scientists at universities and museums in both China and internationally has produced advances in the specific technical challenges of stabilizing painted clay surfaces and of managing the conservation environment of large open excavations that are being applied to other sites beyond Angkor. The development of digital documentation and virtual presentation technologies at the site is producing resources that both support the research program and expand the public accessibility of the site beyond the physical presence required for in-person visits. The three-dimensional scanning of individual figures, the photogrammetric documentation of the pit environments, and the development of virtual reality presentations of the tomb complex are all dimensions of a digital program that is creating a permanent record of the site and making it accessible to audiences worldwide. The ongoing relationship between the Terracotta Army site and the international scholarly community has been one of the more productive long-term collaborations in the field of heritage management and archaeological research. The specific technical challenges of the site, including the conservation of painted surfaces and the management of large-scale open excavation in a climate with significant seasonal variation, have made it a productive environment for the development of new methods that are applicable beyond the specific context of Lintong. The Lus Plain of the Wei River Valley is flat and wide and very old. The farmers who work the soil here are working land that has been under cultivation for thousands of years, and the specific quality of the Lus, pale yellow and fine-grained and patient, holds the seeds and the water and the deep past with equal impartiality. The mound to the west of the road, the one that has been here since before the farmers' families have any memory, is just part of the landscape now, as mountains are part of the landscape of places that have mountains, unavoidable and unremarkable through familiarity. But it is not a mountain. It is the largest royal tomb in the ancient world, the burial place of the man who first unified China, and inside it there are things that no living person has seen. The geophysical surveys can tell us something about its interior. The historical sources can give us Sima Qian's account of what was built there. The mercury concentrations in the soil can confirm that the rivers of mercury that the historian described are probably still there, in whatever condition 2,000 years of chemical change in a sealed underground environment have left them. But what is actually inside, in the specific detail that makes things real rather than hypothetical, is unknown. The warriors standing in their pit 1.5 kilometers to the east were standing in their formations when the Roman Republic was still a functioning political entity, when Julius Caesar had not yet been born, when the Han dynasty that replaced the Qin was still several centuries from its own end. They have been standing there through everything that has happened since, in the dark under the fields, waiting with the patience of things that have no choice but to wait. The farmer who found them broke through the roof of their pit in the spring of 1974. The scholars who came to study them have been studying them ever since. The visitors who come to see them, 2 million per year, look down from the walkways into the ranked formations and see faces looking back at them across 2,000 years of distance. The tomb mound waits on the western horizon, its secrets intact, the mercury still flowing in its simulated rivers, the first emperor still waiting in whatever provision his craftspeople made for his eternity. The light on the mound changes through the day. In the morning it comes from the east, the direction the warriors are facing, and the shadow of the mound falls west, toward where the emperor lies. In the afternoon the light reverses, and the mound catches it from the west and holds it in the specific way that earth holds light, warmly and diffusely, without the sharpness of stone. In the evening the mound goes dark early, its shadow stretching east across the plain, and the warriors in their pits are in complete darkness, as they have been every night for more than 2,000 years, waiting for a dawn they will not see. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.